And hit record. Joe. And Commissioner Glass and President Zarpata, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you. I concur with Paul's sentiment that we should have had the meeting outside for the first couple of days. In about, it seems like 2 weeks, we haven't had rain and oppressive humidity. So it's lovely. Make sure after this meeting that you cancel everything else and get outdoors. So take advantage of it while you can. It's really my charge to welcome everyone and cover a couple of objectives that we're going to work toward in the time that we have together. First, we've got some preliminary findings from our stakeholder engagement that we want to review and go over. We have emerging work group recommendations. We're going to break out into some smaller groups and look at those. And there's a great deal of overlap across those. So I think we're going to be able to synthesize something nicely together for our team here. We're going to identify the conditions that are necessary to implement any of the proposed recommendations we have and sustain those efforts, and then lift up any questions that we have for the other work groups that are operating now too. So that's our goal for the next couple of hours here. So we got a lot to cover. I'll turn things over to Paul to recap the last meeting.
Sure, thanks. So let's see, during our April meeting, we agreed to organize our collective efforts by the use of 3 priority areas: access, alignment, and attainment. Last month, we began our discussions on the identification of key challenges and opportunities for increasing access, alignment, and attainment of EPOs in small groups. These conversations led to the population of the emerging recommendations template you received via email and are also located on the Google folder. These recommendations, as Commissioner Glass previewed, will constitute a large portion of our discussions today. Before we start digging into those emerging recommendations, I'm going to turn it over to our friend at ESG, Lauren, to share the findings from the collective interviews and the focus groups. And I'm still shocked at how many people you all were able to interview in such a short amount of time. I think you'll find the results to be valuable and potentially inform some of our conversations today. Lauren, take it away.
All right, thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to share my screen. While I am doing that and getting the slides set up, feel free, particularly since we are a cozy group today, to ask questions as we go along. So we'll have plenty of time to be able to share everything that we've heard from our conversations with stakeholders across the state, as well as to answer questions that you have. So I would recommend, I'll try to pause a couple times throughout the presentation, but feel free to drop ideas as you have them directly in the chat. And then when we pause, we can go ahead and answer those questions. And then anytime we have left at the end, we can answer questions there too. So with that, move this around. So I wanted to start just sharing a little bit about our process. I know we previewed this to you in earlier meetings, but haven't dug into a lot of detail. So as Paul shared with you earlier, we've done a number of different focus groups and interviews with folks in every region of the state. We focused our protocols and the questions that we asked around the priorities that each of the 3 focus groups have identified. So we had questions around the transition to post-secondary, our group around early post-secondary opportunities, and then the educator diversity and workforce group as well. Generally speaking, those questions were pretty similar across each of the stakeholders that we talked to, but we kind of tweaked them a little bit based on our audience. So the questions we would ask students would look a little bit different than we would ask the president of a higher education institution, for example. The key reason we were able to speak with so many people in a short amount of time was because we really leveraged the regional education cooperatives to help with our recruitment. So we were able to work with every regional co-op across the state. We had assigned them different stakeholders to be able to recruit for, and they did a really fantastic job of finding folks to engage in these conversations. So geographic diversity, recognizing the really unique needs that Kentucky has across the state was our primary focus. But with that said, we also know that it's important for us to understand and lift up the experiences of low-income students and families and communities, as well as of are diverse communities by race and ethnicity. And so each of the regions were really encouraged to think about how they could recruit either practitioners that serve diverse individuals, or when they were recruiting students and families, making sure that they had diverse representation there. So here you'll see the kind of stakeholders that we assigned to each of the kind of work group focus areas. So you'll see for ours, we're the second one, expanding equitable access and success in AP and dual credit. We talked with K-12 counselors, primarily at the high school level, but also talked with elementary and middle school counselors. Same with school and district administrators, higher education leaders. We had a really great group of dual credit coordinators at the higher education level, and then also talked to students and families. Just to give you a preview, we'll share a little bit more at next week's Continuum meeting around what the focus of the other two work groups were, but to give you a preview, the first kind of transition to post-secondary work group, those are really focused on issues such as advising and strengthening advising, increasing FAFSA completion, and kind of strategies that schools and districts are using to support students and families around that, addressing kind of affordability and financial aid writ large, talking about industry recognized credentials, kind of everything under the sun around kind of college and career readiness. And then building, sustaining a diverse educator workforce. They're really focused on kind of hiring, retaining, and training educators, particularly educators of color across the state. So that's really where we focused our attention there. So give you a quick breakdown of who we were able to talk to. So again, we were able to cover across the focus groups and interviews 120 different individuals from across the state. You'll see in the map kind of what the spread was by region, as well as in the chart on the left-hand side, kind of the breakdown by role. So you'll notice that generally speaking, we were pretty strong at being able to find practitioners that were be able to participate in these conversations, particularly counselors, students and parents. We were able to speak to about a dozen each. I think as we think about the Continuum stakeholder engagement efforts moving forward, this is kind of a key area where we might want to do some additional outreach to make sure that we're kind of reaching students and families and hearing directly from them about their needs. As far as the schools and districts that were represented by the practitioners that we talked to, again, we really wanted to make sure that we are lifting up the experiences and the challenges of diverse communities. So you'll see we had a decent spread in terms of the percentage of students of color that were represented in those districts. Most generally had between 0 and 25% students of color, but we still had a pretty good spread across those serving a higher percentage of students of color. And this generally falls in line with the kind of overall distribution in public school enrollment that we see across the state. Similarly, for economically disadvantaged students, I think this is where you see really strong representation, particularly as we talked with rural communities that maybe had less racial and ethnic diversity, but really had a number of low-income students that they were serving. And so we're able to hear about the unique challenges facing those communities. And then most importantly for us, if you remember, we really wanted to make sure that we were talking with individuals who we're seeing a lot of success, we're seeing really strong participation around AP and dual credit, as well as those who didn't have as many offerings or weren't seeing the same types of success as other communities. So we had a pretty good range, both of schools and districts that had a lot of students participating, as well as those who did not. But just like we saw with the national data at our last work group meeting, the number of EPO offerings, this includes both AP and dual credit, really ranged significantly. So some schools only had 3 different dual credit courses or AP courses that they are offering, while others offered 37. So I think the type of options that students are experiencing across the state were pretty variable, and we saw that in our interviews. And then here you can see kind of the spread of higher education institutions. So again, pretty strong spread by role, with us having one really large focus group with our dual credit coordinators, which is why you see strong representation there. Pretty even divide across 2-year and 4-year institutions. And also we're able to talk to a couple private institutions as well to hear about their perspective. And that's kind of a little bit more about our process. So next, I think what you are all been waiting to hear is around the kind of key themes that we heard from our conversations. We tried to indicate from which individual or which stakeholder we particularly heard that piece of feedback, but generally speaking, these are being kind of across all stakeholder groups. So I'm gonna stop for a second. I don't see any questions in the chat, but any questions just in terms of like process or representation across our engagements? All right, well, we're gonna go ahead and dive into what we heard. So we have organized our findings across the 3 priority areas that you as a work group have already identified. So the first is going to be around access. We'll have another set around alignment, and then finally be able to talk about attainment. First, just want to share that by and large, even when stakeholders were identifying challenges around access or funding or other kind of implementation issues, by and large, we heard incredibly positive perceptions around dual credit across the state. Everyone from high school counselors to students and families to higher education institutions really saw the value of dual credit in supporting students' post-secondary access and success. So as you see in these quotes, we had a student who said, dual credit really opened my eyes to looking for options after high school. Another student said they would recommend, dual credit courses to any of their classmates. They really valued the kind of independence that they had and the ability to really work at their own pace. We had a high school principal call for dual credit to continue to be supported, particularly at the state level, because he's really seen kind of positive benefits for his students. So by and large, I think we're seeing a lot of support around dual credit. Around AP, I think the reviews were a little bit more mixed. And so you'll be able to see that as we kind of share some of the challenges that stakeholders are facing across the state. So starting with some of the key themes we heard around access, I think the first is around participation. So dual credit, by and large, we heard there really is no typical student who tends to participate in dual credit. They tend to be more diverse across multiple different factors. So in terms of race and ethnicity, across income status, but also in terms of their kind of academic preparation and kind of status. And so I think a lot of communities really saw that as an asset, and dual credit being a good door opener to having some of those early post-secondary opportunities. AP courses, on the other hand, generally speaking, we heard they tend to serve kind of more white, more middle and upper class students, and tend to be focused on kind of academically high performing students. So a little bit of a difference we saw across those 2 program types. Second challenge yeah, go ahead.
You have a question or comment from Jenny Sawyer.
Yeah, Jenny.
Looks like you're muted, Jenny. Jenny, I think you're muted.
I said, were any of the students that you interviewed students who are already in college looking back on how dual credit and AP influenced their preparation, or were they current high school students?
Yep, so the majority were current high school students, generally juniors and seniors, but we did have 3 post-secondary or current college students that we were able to speak to. But definitely, I think during the time of year, by the time we were doing these interviews, many students were in finals. And so those were a kind of harder group to be able to recruit from, but we did hear from a couple of those students.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so the second key theme we heard around access was around awareness. We really heard from a number of different stakeholders that counselors are really key, as we all know, to providing kind of early exposure, advising, and access to students and families around early post-secondary opportunities. And this was particularly the case for low-income, first-generation, and kind of more diverse students and families. That said, we heard from counselors that they kind of saw a lack of awareness about what these opportunities were, how students could access them. For low-income students, their kind of eligibility for scholarships and other ways to kind of financially support dual credit. And so I think we've talked about this a lot in this work group, but trying to think about how we can really build awareness and have a really strong kind of communications outreach to these communities so that more students are participating. And then the third theme we heard around access is just in terms of course offerings. Again, we've talked about this a lot as a work group. There's really significant variability across schools in the number and types of EPO courses they can offer. And of course, this is particularly true for kind of rural and small schools and districts who kind of have less access to some of these resources. So you'll see in the quote on the left-hand side, I think equity really came through in our conversations around equity. The first counselor really talked about beyond just kind of broad awareness, a lot of students who are kind of underrepresented in EPO courses not feeling a sense of belonging in these courses. They don't see other diverse students participating in those classes. They don't have teachers or counselors always reaching out directly to them to encourage them to participate. And so just as we think about some kind of training and additional advising and resources might be one thing we want to consider in our recommendations. Kind of similarly, I think the amount of parent advocacy that students from diverse backgrounds tend to have differs from that of their kind of white and middle and upper class peers. So counselor talked about every single year, they had a group of parents who would advocate for their students, just whether they were eligible or not to participate in AP or dual credit. And that ultimately at the urging of their kind of school or district administrators would end up enrolling those students, but they didn't get that same kind of advocacy and outreach from their low income or more diverse parents. And so they said, even though we have really strong relationships, we're doing a lot of family engagement, really strengthening that from an awareness perspective would be something to consider at the local level. A couple more challenges we heard around access. First is around teacher capacity. We heard over and over again, particularly from high school administrators, that teacher certification and training was a big challenge. We also heard this from higher education staff, and this was particularly true for smaller districts. This is more an issue for dual credit, but we also heard this for AP, where even though they didn't have the same kind of like credentialing requirements for AP, a lot of principals wanted their high school teachers to have a little bit more training or a little bit more preparation to be able to teach these more advanced courses. Also around advising, so again, counselors are really playing the primary role in encouraging students to participate. Many counselors that we talked about a number of different ways that they're trying to build exposure and build that exposure really early. So oftentimes before students even step foot on a high school campus. So working really closely with their middle schools to be able to provide some early exposure. Many talked about the benefit of individualized learning plans. And even though that can sometimes be a kind of like checkbox activity or more in an accountability measure, a lot of counselors are really trying to reframe that as a really valuable tool around advising to set students up for success to be able to participate in EPO courses. And the last was around funding. So we heard a lot of stakeholders viewed the state scholarships as being beneficial. Since that is capped at 2 courses, this is where we saw kind of a big equity disparity. So some districts said it's important for all of our students to be able to participate. We will find the funds in our general budget or kind of elsewhere. If students want to take more courses and funding would stand in their way, we'll be able to make sure that they participate. We heard from other districts or other schools that said, we don't have that kind of funding to be able to fill in those gaps. So our students can take the 2 courses that they qualify for the state scholarship, and then that's kind of it. So that kind of creates some kind of inequities there. But by and large, I think we heard a lot of appreciation for the state kind of funding behind dual credit, as well as for, if you remember from our last work group meeting, the kind of AP exam fees that are being covered by the state as well. Couple things that we want to spotlight that came up time and again. First is Gear Up. So Gear Up is a federal grant program It naturally provides really strong advising opportunities, particularly for low-income students. And so we heard from many high school counselors and principals that Gear Up was a really promising program to add some additional advising capacity, particularly at under-resourced schools, and that encouraging students to participate in early post-secondary opportunities was a core part of that kind of advising support that Gear Up provides. The second we heard was around KIA's outreach counselors. So for those of you who may not know, KIA has 13 regional outreach counselors that serve Kentucky's 120 counties. We heard particularly from counselors also as a really valuable resource in kind of bolstering some of the advising capacity that they have for students and families around early post-secondary opportunities. So 2 things for us to highlight. I see a couple questions in the chat. So I'll pause here for a second, but if anyone has questions before we move on to the next section, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask there. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on then. So for our second category, first, we heard a couple pieces of feedback around policies, particularly around eligibility policies. We already know there's pretty significant variability across schools and institutions for eligibility requirements for students to participate, particularly around dual credit. We heard by and large from a number of different principals, they're trying to break down a lot of barriers that would cause students not to be able to participate. You see that in that quote on the top left. Many schools have started to have more open enrollment policies or are using kind of multiple measures for students to be able to qualify. So if a student doesn't meet the GPA requirement, but they have sufficient test scores or vice versa, or using kind of counselor or teacher recommendations as an alternative to be able to place students in courses, they are doing so. But another thing we heard around policies is beyond just kind of the access element of it was that we already know students and families sometimes have a hard time navigating what some of these different policies are, but we also heard a lot from school counselors, school administrators, as well as higher ed staff that the two sectors are having a hard time keeping track of what all the different policies are. So we heard from, for example, like higher education dual enrollment coordinators that we work with, 3 different districts and multiple different high schools within those districts. It's really hard for me to keep track on who's letting their students be eligible to participate in these courses, who lets their students come off campus, and that may differ across different kind of student requirements for that school. So all of that is really, I think, a lot for schools as well as students and families to be able to keep track of. Second is around partnerships. By and large, we heard in order to have particularly a strong dual credit program, you have to have really strong relationships with your local higher education institutions. They kind of classified those strong relationships as having really consistent, clear communication channels, really working together around kind of a targeting of students for enrollment, of advising students, and providing academic support for students. In supporting, kind of mutually supporting instructors for these courses. So doing kind of shared professional development, inviting high school instructors to the high school campus to work with faculty around curricula development or standards. I think really building strong partnerships across the two sectors was key. And then the last is around pathways. You guys already noted this in your emerging recommendations, but a lot said early college programs or career pathway programs that have dual credit opportunities embedded in them have been really valuable in providing early exposure to students, as well as have been a good entry point for students. In fact, we heard in some of our student conversations that a lot of students got involved in dual credit because they were in a career pathway and they didn't even know about dual credit as an option until they just naturally started getting enrolled in classes as part of their career pathway programs, and then found themselves enrolling in a lot more courses. And then our last one, first, we saw a number of different challenges around preparation. You guys noted this as well in your emerging recommendations. So many counselors identified academic preparation as a key challenge for students. But this wasn't just around content knowledge or having the right GPA or having the right kind of test scores to be able to be successful in these courses, but also recognizing kind of some of the softer skills that students need to be successful. So having good study skills, having good time management skills, being able to be independent and successful, and kind of navigating what a college course looks like was key. And then the second is around credit transfer. So particularly we heard this around AP courses. There was a big concern among student and families around the passing rates for exams and kind of relying on one single test to be able to earn credit that would transfer towards their post-secondary degree. And we heard, generally speaking, again, mostly from students and families, that they viewed AP as a little bit riskier, particularly for students who already knew they wanted to go to school in state. They already understood if they took dual credit, how those credits would transfer. And so generally speaking, we heard kind of stronger sentiments around dual credit because it was just viewed as a sure bet. They knew that they had all year to be able to kind of meet the benchmarks that they would need. And they felt a little bit safer that the institutions they would seek to go to after high school would be able to accept that credit. We did not hear, I know we talked about credit transfer for dual credit, not to say it is not a concern, but that didn't come up to the extent that we thought it would in our conversations kind of across the board. That said, we did, if you see in this quote in the bottom left, did have a couple counselors that said, generally speaking, they have a general sense of how credits will transfer, but it'd be great if all of that information was kind of synthesized into a single place. And so we heard a couple calls for, maybe we need like a statewide database that just makes it really easy for not only counselors, but students and families to understand how credits will transfer. A couple programs we want to spotlight here in Jefferson County. Their community and technical college has an Accelerate to College program. That's pretty innovative. So they brought together, so talking about the strength of partnerships, they brought together their local high school English instructors, as well as their higher ed faculty around both English and developmental education. And they designed a course that high school students can take, I believe, in their junior year, where if students pass that class, then they pass an equivalent course at Kctcs, and then that makes them eligible to take any dual credit course from then on. So it's a way to kind of address that academic preparation concern that we heard, so that students will have that option in their senior year. They've also developed a similar course in math, but that's only offered for seniors in their fall semester. And so they have an option really to take their second dual credit course in the spring if they pass that course. Another we heard really to strengthen the kind of communication piece and strengthen the advising component is having early alert systems that are kind of shared access between higher ed and K-12. So Starfish came up a lot. A ton of different institutions across Kentucky use Starfish. This enables what we heard in our interviews was faculty to, if they have any academic concerns, as well as just bright spots that they want to share, they can use Starfish. That will automatically flag to dual enrollment coordinators who can then reach down to high school counselors just to flag if a student's having a particular issue, and they can work together to figure out whether they need additional tutoring or additional mentorship, whatever kind of student support that that particular student needs. So that's kind of what we heard in our conversation. I'll pause one more time before we go to the last section, have some kind of recommendations for how we might think in our breakout groups around implications for our emerging recommendations. So again, if you have a question, feel free to take yourself off mute. I'll try to take a look at the chat and see if there's any questions there too.
So this is Lori Beth Wilson. The early alert system with Starfish and the aligned advising transfer database that's not out there, kind of out there, but those two things would be an incredible assistance in helping all of our dual credit students. So I agree, and accolades for you to bring that up. And then Starfish, if it is a great early alert as long as the faculty members are putting information in there.
It's a very good flag. And appreciate that.
This is Gene Hutchins. I would just like to comment on the Accelerate to College program. I think that hopefully it's being utilized system-wide in JCPS. Because what we see, we spend a lot of time through the college outreach counselors helping people apply or fill out the FAFSA, basically complete the FAFSA. That is strongly correlated with the extent to which students feel like they are prepared to succeed in post-secondary education. And if they have, I know right now we have co-requisite courses once somebody gets to college, but unless these students feel like they have a chance, not only are they not enrolling in dual credit, they're not going to enroll in college to a greater extent than other students that feel like they are better prepared. So any kind of remediation, which this is what Accelerate to College sounds like, to bolster skills, get kids on a college track, it's going to spill over into the numbers of kids that fill out and their families to fill out the FAFSA. Because we see, like I said, we see a big disparity between those students that are academically prepared going on to post-secondary education and those that aren't. And we really need a mechanism to try and bolster their skills while they're still in high school, if possible. It's a great program. I'd like to see it used more.
100% agree. And I know the transition to post-secondary work group is talking a lot about increasing FAFSA completion. So I think that's a really good point of how are we leveraging existing programs like Accelerate to College to embed some of those kind of more procedural milestones that students need to complete around enrollment. It's a very good point. Any others?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions on the parents and students. Did that include people that didn't take dual credit to kind of get a perspective of why they didn't take dual credit?
Yeah, I think this is a good opportunity. And I think we talked about this at the last work group meeting of how we might want to do some additional engagement, looking, I think, for the continuum over the summer or the fall. I think that's kind of where we had the hardest time recruiting individuals. So I think we were able to capture that from a practitioner lens, but a lot less so from a student and family lens. I would say every student that I talked to at least had participated primarily in dual credit. We had some students who are participating in AP, but I think we definitely need to learn more around why students aren't participating in those opportunities directly from students and families.
And the other question too, some of the feedback that you got, was there a difference in the feedback depending on where they took, the courses, whether it was on a college campus versus a high school?
Yep. I would say generally not, though we didn't probe too much just in terms of delivery. We tend to ask whether they were going to the high school or the college campus or had the courses on their high school campus. We heard both, but again, could have been self-selection, so that the students we were talking with generally were selected by high school counselors at their school. So I think generally speaking, we were speaking to kind of high-performing students who had gained a lot from their dual credit experiences. And so across the board, again, perceptions are really high amongst students, kind of regardless of delivery type, which speaks again to the, I think, need for some additional engagement. Okay. Any other questions before we move to the last section? Okay. So after we kind of analyzed all of these interviews and focus groups, took another look at the set of emerging recommendations that the work group has put together, kind of asked two different questions. So like, one, where are we seeing kind of the biggest kind of challenges that we really need to address based off of what we're hearing from stakeholders? Where do we really need to double down based off of things that we've already identified in the emerging recommendations? And the second was, what's really missing? So what haven't we really captured? Where might we need to probe a little bit more or flesh out some additional recommendations? So with that, you'll have plenty of time to be able to dig into this a little bit more in your breakout groups, but wanted to just give you guys some food for thought for where you might really focus as you're working to prioritize or build out your recommendations in your breakout groups. So I think the first question we want to ask ourselves is, how we can expand the number and type of EPO course offerings, particularly for small, rural, and under-resourced communities. So I think we had identified that we want to have really strong, equitable access so that all students have the opportunity to participate in an EPO course, because we see the value in doing that. So a couple different options, either from things that we heard in our interviews or things we've seen in other states. One, obviously expanding partnerships between districts and institutions, to be able to offer across a few different modalities, or to share credentialed instructors. So having higher education faculty who can be able to meet kind of K-12 credentialing requirements, be able to teach dual credit courses, for example. Or if you have kind of small communities, having agreements where teachers can teach across multiple high schools. It's one thing we've seen work well. Second is investing in and expanding early college and career academy programs. So again, we heard both of those are really strong levers. Kentucky has a number of really strong programs in each, but thinking about how we can continue to expand those opportunities. Second question for the group to consider, how we can increase the number of high school teachers with necessary training and credentials. I think in our recommendations so far, we have a lot around professional development and training. Probably need to think a little bit more around the credentialing side. So a couple different ways we've seen work there. One, providing incentives. That could be scholarships, bonuses, loan forgiveness programs for teachers to be able to complete their graduate coursework. Another opportunity is trying to embed opportunities for teachers to meet credentialing requirements earlier. This is something we specifically heard from, I believe, a high school principal who asked, can we embed it in teacher preparation programs? Can we offer credit for prior learning? Like, how can we provide multiple pathways for teachers to have the right credentials to teach EPO courses, again, particularly dual credit. Third question is how we might increase the number of students who are academically prepared and supported for EPO courses. We already have tutoring in our recommendations. We know that that's going to be really important to be able to establish. We can also think we've seen places establish kind of early post-secondary opportunity courses, whether that's a pre-AP track, a pre-dual credit track, coupled with really intensive advising and academic supports starting in 8th or 9th grade. One thing you need to consider with that one, obviously we don't want to track students into particular pathways, so making sure that those remain kind of open access and you're providing the necessary supports, particularly for underrepresented students in those tracks. The second is around providing early intervention. So again, we already have tutoring. We heard a strong example of prerequisite supports and transition courses, as well as thinking about multiple measures for eligibility. We heard a general call for a little bit more standardization, and I think we have that in our emerging recommendations just around eligibility. Next thing we might want to consider is how we can increase transparency and awareness around a couple different things, course offerings, course alignment, and credit transfer. So as you saw, we saw a call for some statewide online hub for counselors, higher education staff, students, and families to be able to have access to all this information. A number of other states have done this particularly well, so we can share some of those examples in the breakout groups. Or adopting a uniform credit policy, for example, for AP and dual credit courses among all public institutions, just so students feel pretty confident that their courses will be accepted. Last two, so thinking about how we can bolster advising. Advising comes up a lot in the emerging recommendations. So one thing, potentially leveraging AP potential or a related metric to identify students earlier that have the potential to succeed in these courses, and then targeting advising to them. For example, Connecticut had an AP activation campaign they've run for the past number of years and have found it to be really successful in increasing enrollment in AP courses. So the state uses AP potential data. They send a letter to every single student who meets the AP potential kind of thresholds and says, like, you should definitely enroll. Here's the kind of the value of AP. You should reach out to your counselor to be able to do that. And then they also do kind of training and additional support to counselors just to advise students, particularly those who are underrepresented in courses, to be able to participate. Another idea could provide training and resources, particularly on shifting adult mindsets. So we had identified a challenge amongst our work group members that was kind of echoed in what we heard from stakeholders is not every particularly K-12 practitioner really believes that every student is capable of succeeding or should participate in early post-secondary opportunities. So trying to think about how we can kind of shift adult mindsets around that expectation that every student should participate, as well as speaking to that concern we heard around building students' sense of belonging. So the role that educators and counselors can play in making sure that underrepresented students feel that they belong in dual credit courses. And then lastly, thinking about the funding issue, again, we heard a lot of support for the state grant. So thinking about how we might want to kind of expand funding for that, or just the kind of cap on number of courses that can take, particularly for low-income students. We've seen other states offer equity grants, particularly for under-resourced communities, that can help cover some additional fees or additional courses if we want to increase the number of kind of diverse students who are participating. Another idea, there's now a lot of federal funding. So a lot of states and districts are thinking about how they can bolster particularly dual credit with some of the new stimulus funding that's coming from the federal government, or leveraging their ESSA funds, Gear Up, Perkins, a number of other kind of federal sources, just to expand that kind of funding pot for EPO courses. So a couple ideas to think about. There'll be plenty of time in your breakout groups to think about things that you might want to add to the list of emerging recommendations, things you want to reprioritize, but a couple things to kind of get you started. And so with that, I think I'll stop sharing, but we have a few more minutes. Looks like we have about 5 more minutes before we need to go into breakout groups. So if there are any other questions, again, feel free to chime in. I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks, Lauren. Does anyone have any questions? Looks like we're all roaring to get into our breakout groups.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We had a great conversation in our group, so I hope that all of you did as well. Just really got into some of the details around the recommendations and what we heard from Lauren's presentation. And I don't know that we were able to get through all of them, but we got some depth on stuff, so it was really really great. I think that each of our breakout groups was asked to come on and just tell a synopsis of what you were able to pull out in the conversation. So maybe we could start with our alignment group, the one that I was in. I know we had an exceptional note taker who's ready to go and excited. Honestly, I kind of conscripted her into the role, so she's going to do it begrudgingly, but she's going to be great. Melina, can you come on and kick us off?
Thanks, Dr. Glass. Yeah, my name is Melina Tirachi. I'm in the alignment group. And we talked about if you're following on the emerging recommendations document, I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit. But we talked about one of the programs that came up in Lauren's presentation was how inviting school faculty to post-secondary institutions to help design and align courses and develop curriculum really met with what we were kind of talking about in previous meetings about one, preparing students better for college courses in dual credit and aligning their course goals all the way through. And then also it's professional development, where we brought that up over and over again, is how do we provide professional development to our high school level or earlier, so that we're not wasting the students' time, we're not wasting the faculty's time. And then when they get to a post-secondary placement, they really have the value included there. We kind of ended our conversation talking about another model that does almost the same thing, but we want to look at high school teachers being able to go into the field for career shadowing and making sure that any topics that they're teaching that would match up with post-secondary career opportunities, that the curriculum actually matches what's going on in the workplace. So partnerships like that, we think would have a lot of value, and it matches what the stakeholders were also bringing up. We also think kind of the flip side of that, making sure that college professors have the credentials and making it more streamlined for them to be able to teach the college credit or dual credit courses at the high school level. That kind of policy can really grease the wheels for a student to be better prepared, but also the faculty to be better prepared and high quality. We also brought up that eligibility is used at the beginning of our recommendations. And I actually have the question of, isn't eligibility more of an access question? And here we're talking more about, if you think of it as like a through line with the inconsistency of, I've taken my dual credit courses, I've taken my AP credits, but how does that place me at post-secondary level? Where do I go from there? So making sure that what I've taken actually makes me eligible for what I need to take at the post-secondary level. So we want to make sure that those are aligned. But then we got really into it about, and not into it in a bad way, I think we just had a lot of thoughts on, are these requirements like prereqs, co-reqs, are those doing more harm than good? Are they actually gates for high school students to get the credit that they need? Are there better predictors that we could use? So we talked about some that there's really good data that backs up. The ACT is a good predictor here, but GPA in a course is a good predictor here. And maybe we can rethink some of those requirements, or even how like a high school schedule works. One of the reasons we have a lot of issues is at the high school level, your schedule is pretty set. You can't really waste time on a prerequisite to get to your dual credit course. So you might as well take the bare minimum. What if it looked more like a college semester? What if you could take a summer course and could change how our hours look? So we talked a little bit about that. We also talked about the gap between the talent of graduating students and the needed workforce. So now we're talking about from high school to your career. We want talent retention. We want you to prepare for the jobs that are out there. So partnerships with those high schools and colleges to make sure that we're also preparing for areas that are needed for the workforce, specifically tech. We're looking at what kind of jobs we need in the tech field in Kentucky. We're also looking at what else might be leading in the workforce. So investing in those universities and partnerships that are already leading, and maybe we can look at ideas. There was one kind of thrown out there of like, what if it's like a study abroad kind of program? We know that there's really good programs in this field at another university. Can I get you into a dual credit program there? What does that look like? Let's see. Obviously the document and like / database that shows where dual credit classes will be accepted, what requirements they count toward. That's again, that eligibility piece, so that we know. And I know everybody is like very excited about the database idea, but that's a really good, again, through line where if that database is comprehensive enough, then it's, it reduces all of the unnecessary confusion and fear around these courses and these opportunities. We talked about partnerships, like I said, with the Chamber of Commerce, local industry, local organizations, to do job shadowing, co-ops, to get workplace experience, because Sophie was actually explaining, like, there are so many courses where it's supposed to prepare you for the workplace. So if you're taking engineering courses very early on in your career, and you're still in high school taking them, but then your teacher's like, yeah, I was an engineer and this is not at all what my job was like. Well, then you have no idea if that's what you want to do. So then you end up with your placement and you're actually not happy. So doing more of these kind of externship type programs or field studies would make a lot of sense for us. So I think that like linked with the pathways where students would not know about dual credit until they were in a pathway, and then they take their dual credit, and there's a lot of value there. So I think overall, we talked a lot about how do we add value to what we can offer here. And then there should be policy to kind of grease the wheels on that. Okay, that's it. How'd I do?
Great, Melina, fantastic. I knew I had chosen wisely when asked to report out. I think the underlying theme here is one of connections, right? And how important the connections are between high school experience and higher education experience and the workforce, and how everything gets better when we've got good connections and people are understanding each other and working well together. So I'll pause here and see if members of the other groups that were breakout groups that were meeting have any feedback or heard any common themes and some of the things that Melina raised up in her report out. Just any things that we want to underscore, as this is really important and we want to make sure that we hang on to these ideas. So any feedback?
I think something you're going to hear from the other group is that the database is great, but you need to have the articulation agreements in place so that courses being offered by, say, Kctcs will be accepted at Eastern or UK or U of L, and so that the student can have some confidence that they're not spinning their wheels by taking the dual credit course.
Great, thanks, Gene. Okay, having created enough wait time to make people uncomfortable, I think we'll move on. Let's go to our access group where Meredith was facilitating, Lauren was the note taker, and I'm sure you found Melina set a high bar for our group. So I don't know.
Did indeed.
Let's see how it goes.
We're ready to meet that challenge with Dan. Dan, take it away.
We're ready, but Melina has set a high bar. I would agree with that. But there was some commonalities between what Melina said and what our group talked about. We spent a lot of time talking about kind of advising. That really, again, comes out. But of aligning, one of the things we talked about is aligning student interest with the AP and dual credit. And sometimes, many times, students are just taking courses and they don't understand how they fit into their ultimate career goal. And so we talked about the alignment issue, came across a lot. Alignment with their own plans, their own career plans, and alignment between the curriculum being offered at the high school and the college level. And we talked about the articulation agreements between Kctcs and the universities. And even though I think many of those exist, people aren't aware of them. And that was one thing we talked about, that making people aware of some of the resources that are already out there for them. For example, we talked about AP, the state paying for AP. Many times people, AP test, and many times people just aren't aware of that. So there's the connections and awareness. We talked about advising, beginning this whole process, at least at the middle school. We spent some time just talking about some of these kind of pre-EPO opportunities, pre-EPO classes to get students familiar with, get parents familiar with the process at the middle school and preparing them that these are our opportunities. And just part of that process. And part of the advising process, we went back and talked about the individual learning plans and schools that have done those well, but really working with students to help them identify kind of a career pathway early on and not looking at the ILPs as just a burden that has to be completed, but really embedded in the, embedded in the school, embedded with teachers. We talked about professional development, and most of our time, many times we talk about just for the counselors, but we really felt it was important to embed this whole concept in the teacher ed programs and the teacher prep programs, and even while they're at the universities in those programs, but at least in professional development, that, the teachers are the ones that really have the most contact with students, and they need to be familiar with and to buy into this. As Melina talked about, we talked about also having the opportunity for teachers to go out in the world, into businesses, and to spend time understanding the careers, understanding what the skills are that are needed to enter a career. And just that, I thought we talked about that. Again, there was an old model where high school teachers were paid to spend a week. They were kind of given a scholarship year. I mean, it's a long time ago. But to go out into the business world and to make that alignment. So teachers were aware of that. And we're kind of operating in a vacuum. So we talked about that. Again, just looking at this as a continuum from really elementary, middle, high school, college, but that is really important in that process of doing that. The alignment, setting kind of the cultural expectations early on. For that, we still find that some teachers and administrators don't buy into the whole concept of kind of the early post-secondary opportunities that are at schools. And so looking at that and trying to build on that. And I'm sure I've left things out, but those are kind of the main things. So
It's perfect.
that Meredith talked me into doing this.
She's compelling.
Chose
It's
wisely.
compelling.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Great job. I think if I were to identify a theme in what you talked about, it's advising and the importance of that advising. And it circles back to something that the previous group, our group, talked about around these externship opportunities where you have teachers that have the opportunities to work and learn in higher education or work and learn in the workforce. And so there's which goes back to the theme of the other group too, around the importance of those relationships and connections. So I think we've got a couple of themes emerging here around connections and relationships and the importance of advising. And our challenge really is to think about what are some ways that we can make that systemic and formalized, right? So I'll stop and see if any of the other group members and other groups had any feedback or reactions to what Dan was talking about. Dan, great job. Thank you.
I thought Dan brought up a really good point. You know, we have got hundreds, if not thousands, of transfer articulation agreements. We just don't have a great place to show that to everyone. We're working on it.
Yeah, that is so true. We've spent out years forming these articulation agreements, and somehow to make people aware of that, even make them aware at the high school level, I don't think people just don't see that transition.
And we got in trouble for doing one with Southern New Hampshire University.
Yeah.
I have
Any
a
other
question.
feedback? Go ahead.
Yeah, in the presentation, it mentioned AP potential as like a way to kind of find students who are better suited to academic advanced placement courses. I don't know anything about AP potential, but it seemed like from just like that summary, it seemed like a easy place to continue bias for students. Like we've talked about like lots of teachers don't see the value or don't have like the, growth mindset of like, all students have potential. So an exam or essay or assessment called AP potential that's supposed to be identifying students raised concerns for me, but I also feel like I don't know enough about it. So I wanted to know if you guys had thoughts.
I think that's a good point. I think it's to be seen more as a tool and not an indicator. And that's how we communicate it to our schools. It's there to use, but it's not there to exclude, right? Or because that's what you would get. If you don't meet an X number, you're not ready for the course. It's a snapshot of a student in time, and it's just one piece of the picture. We some students are late bloomers, so you don't count any student out at any point. But I think it's just a tool, and but a good point that it should just be should be communicated that way, that this is just a single tool.
Great, thanks for the explanation, Anthony. Any other feedback for our group around access or reactions or thoughts?
I do want to mention, we talked a little bit at the end of our group about the JCTC program that is funded separately from the dual credit KIA scholarship that focuses on those students and having them take a course that prepares them to then be dual credit ready in their senior year? And are there some opportunities for expansion of that or even funding of that? I'm not sure how JCTC or what, I think they had a private donor that actually helps fund that program. But I think they started out with wanting 50 students and ended up with like 200 or 300 in
Yeah.
the first year of the program. So,
You know, and thank you for mentioning that. I mean, that's sort of along the theme that I was mentioning. Dual credit assumes a certain level of preparedness. You have to take a college level course. And if somewhere along the way, you didn't receive the preparation that you need, does that close that door? And not only does it close the door to dual credit, but eventually it's going to close the door to post-secondary higher education. So my thought is the sooner any kind of needed remediation can be done, the better. Because, you know, students are, you know, they're human beings that have self-images, and unless we try and channel them on the right track, they're not going to complete the FAFSA. They're not going to enroll. And if they do somehow do both of those, they may not succeed because they're coming in underprepared. So, and again, if you can do it in high school, that's ideal, because we do have co-requisite courses. Probably works great for kids that just need some moderate remediation, but where you have students that have fallen several grades behind where they need to be, it's a tough hill for them to climb.
Excellent point, Jane. We have a comment from Sophie in the chat here, really getting at the problems with the rigidity of the high school schedule and how it's hard to get the classes that you want when you need them.
Commissioner, this is David. I'd also like to point out, when I was visiting with one of the presidents at the Kctcs, there's a lot of other barriers besides not being academically ready that causes students not to succeed in college. And we need not forget those, you know, life happening, flat tires. I've heard of flat tires preventing someone from being able to get there, cars not working, all that kind of thing. So I think we have to keep those in mind too.
Well, it's the heart of the equity challenge, David, that, you know, a car problem for one student is an inconvenience. A car problem for another student is a life-changing and opportunity-changing event. So it's different. We need to move to our last group, but before I do so, just any other feedback for Dan and his group on the things that they raise, really focusing on that importance of advising students of future options and starting that early.
Well, with the Attainment group, Jenny Sawyer has bravely volunteered to share out.
Okay, let's go there, Paul. So let's go ahead.
so we actually started our conversation by talking about some of the recommendations, the emerging recommendations that we really think are more, that are very important, but really belong as a part of the access recommendations. One is the statewide certification program for college and career counseling. And we talked about how in some of our very small school districts, particularly, that really needs, or principals and superintendents really need the flexibility to have those types of programs be eligible to all faculty and staff in the building, because many times that advising role, that college and career advising role falls upon the high school counselors are already burdened. So we talked about that. And then we talked about the whole topic of incentivizing teachers to be certified, and how that dilemma is very core at growing EPO courses, and particularly growing it to more diverse populations. And we need to look creatively at the solutions to how do we get more, you know, dual credit teachers, and how are the different ways in which we deliver EPO courses. And then we started, like everybody else, with our number one strategy being that we had agreement on was the fact of the Common Course catalog. Key, I think, in that every other group has mentioned is that it be something that's easy to navigate, that's very accessible, that's very prominent. I think it almost needs to be built into that registration and initial process when a course is rolled out. A syllabus is for students to see right there. This is how this course is going to transfer to colleges and universities, and this is where it transfers, and this is where it can fit into your curriculum. So you're not depending on the students who have parents who know to go look for those and ask those questions, for the schools that have people that have time for that. Then the second one does have to do with incentivizing schools and districts to offer EPO courses and more EPO courses. The second one has to developing better advising support for students coming from underrepresented and under-resourced groups to use advising as a tool early on to get them on track to be ready for EPO courses. I think it's our last one has to do with really how do we provide early opportunities both to the students and to the families, so that families and parents, we saw that quote from the principal who talked about parents who advocate for their students to be an EPO, and that how do we make all families aware of those opportunities for their children, so that they can be watching for those opportunities and moving their students into those opportunities. So did I miss anything, guys, from my group?
No, I think.
Oh, I know. We did also talk about, even though I think Adam said it's actually in the CPE document for dual credit, but do we want to consider incentivizing for the university's NACEP accreditation? And would that be a way to address faculty development, training, mentorship, issues related to rigor? If we were to tie that back to NACEP accreditation. And Adam, I'll let you speak a little bit more on that if you want to. We have only two institutions in the state that are NACEP accredited.
Yeah, the two are West Kentucky Community Technical College and Owensboro Community Technical College. Laura Beth Wilson's on this call. She certainly can answer any questions if anybody has. That's right. The CPE policy encourages colleges to go through that, but there's no actual incentives, as you say, either financial or otherwise.
In my mind, that almost provides like a blueprint for the colleges and universities to be doing those things with the high schools that provide for rigor, provide for alignment, provide for faculty training and development.
So not to, this is Lori Beth again. Adam said we are NACEP accredited. Just to let you know, I mean, NACEP gives us a lot of resources, valuable resources, but they do not provide the professional development. They give us guidance on it. So it's not like it's there and here, do this type of thing. But what it does is it holds our college accountable to make sure that we provide the professional development for the dual credit faculty members and make sure that the students are getting advised. We have a process in place, and then every time we go back up for accreditation, they want to see what those processes and procedures are so that we're following them at a national level. So it's not as rigid that it has to be this, this, and this. You provide what you provide on your campus for your regular faculty or what you provide for your regular students. It just simply holds you accountable at another level. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks to our Attainment team. Thanks, Jenny. Great job presenting and summarizing. Any other feedback from the other groups on what you heard from the Attainment group?
I would just like to provide feedback from something I saw in the chat from Melina, because we did talk about that in our group, that maybe a way to facilitate better course offerings to smaller school districts would be to have them offered remotely. But I think Dan made the case that that's a model, but it's not going to work unless there's support, teacher support in the school there with the students while they're taking these courses. To expect the students to, high school students to fully engage in a remote course offering is, he said the experience hasn't been good, but if a teacher is there, it does work.
And that's one of the things that we encourage all of our high schools to do, is to have a proctor that engages with the students at least once a week. But most of them are in that classroom with that proctor and say, hey, don't forget to check your email. Don't forget you have a deadline coming up. Tell us what's going on. And so, as you said, Mr. Hutchins, that is an incredibly important piece of it. And as we talked about earlier, and I can't remember if it was in the small breakout group or the other with ILPs, it just having that person in place, and the resources that we can have. So again, touching that student, letting them know someone cares about them enough to remind them to check an email means more than you could possibly imagine. Touching that student and saying, hey, and I say touch, believe me, I meant, connecting with that student and saying, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? Did you know you could do these kind of things? Did you know you needed to have, more English lit, or, whatever it is? Connecting with that student, someone at the campus, means the world. But you have to have the resources.
Great. Thanks, Lori Beth. Then thanks, everybody. I want to be cognizant of our time here and make sure that we're moving along. I'll try and identify just a few themes I heard high level across the groups that we can identify and take forward. One of them was the importance of these connections and relationships between our schools, high schools, and going even to middle schools and staff there, with institutions of higher education and with the workforce and opportunities for all of those systems to learn from each other. And so really building those relationships and getting people visiting and moving back and forth across those systems and building those relationships. So that's a theme that we heard. And even the formalization of some of that into these databases around course catalogs, articulation agreements. So how can we, formalize those connections and relationships in some ways. Another major theme that was lifted up was that of the importance of advising, particularly advising with an equity lens, how we make sure that all of our students are supported and aware of these opportunities, or provided access to these opportunities. Some discussion around some of the barriers that we put in place, either through gates or prerequisites or scheduling problems that we know will have an inequitable impact on students, or sometimes just a random impact, depending on, because there's not consistency around what the prerequisites might be from one community to the next. So that was a major theme that rose up, was just the importance of advising and how we need to do a better job at that. Another theme that rose up, I think, was around the importance of really a continuum of professional learning, from pre-service to in-service, considering certification programs, credentialing, externships, experiential learning. So that was a major theme I think we raised up. So those are three that I heard. And then I think a couple of overarching ideas that go across all of these, and really everything we talked about, was one of support, that our students need greater supports, our families need greater supports, our staff members need greater supports, and again, from that equity lens. So that's, I think, an overarching theme as well. So I think at this point, Jennifer, I turn things to you for next steps. But if I heard from everyone right, I think we've identified some common areas across these groups that we can take forward.
Most definitely. And just know that this is certainly an ongoing and organic process, as you all have noticed. Certainly, no one's trying to plant things in your head, but this list is really going to continue to be refined as we move forward. So with that, just a reminder for those of you in the full continuum or not, it meets next Wednesday June 23rd at 1 p.m. It is live streamed, so if anyone's not a member and you do wish to view the meeting, you can access that on YouTube or through the CPE page, certainly at your leisure. It'll be during this time that the priorities from today are shared with the full continuum for their consideration and certainly discussion. At that time, we'll get lots of feedback that we'll bring back then to our July meeting. So that meeting is Wednesday, July 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern. So please just make sure you've got that on your calendar. If you have any questions or don't, feel free to reach out. And certainly in the interim, we'll make sure that we continue to populate the Google folder with any notes from today and any other resources. So with that, thank you again for engaging. It's really tough during a June, and as Paul pointed out, nice day. So thanks for your heavy lifting, and we appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.